So, US President Donald Trump has come up with a new threat. He is talking about raising import levies on some Canadian imports to 35%. However, there's still, as usual, a lack of clarity as to what goods exactly will be subject to this new higher duty if it's applied. We're joined by John Boscariol, leader of the International Trade and Investment Law Group at McCarthy Tetrault. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, John.
Great to be back, Andrew.
The latest we're hearing from U.S. trade officials is that goods under the Canada-U.S. Mexico trade agreement will not be subject to this new high level, but apparently they say that situation is fluid.
Yeah, we've been hearing the same thing. Those are unofficial comments or rumors, perhaps coming from White House officials. That's very helpful news. I think when we first received the letter last night, it didn't seem to indicate that there would still be an exemption available for goods that qualify under CUSMA or the USMCA. That is, if that is true, that's a very important development, and that is hopeful news for Canadian companies. Although if you're in the auto industry, if you're in steel or aluminum, obviously you're still being hit with those very high tariffs, so we still need to do something about that.
And you have told us, you and other trade experts and practitioners have told us that this is shaping up to be a nightmare for many companies, calculating what duties apply to what profits or products.
It is, because for decades, we were all operating under the assumption that tariffs would be zero anyways, or close to zero, and they were. And it wasn't until Trump introduced this tariff of 25%, and now possibly 35%, that companies, and the exemption that went along with it, that companies now had to take a very hard look at their manufacturing processes, the materials, the ingredients, look at proportions, where they come from, what their origin is, look at the rules of origin under the trade agreements, all to make sure that those products do qualify under the USMCA to be able to enter the US market on a duty-free basis.
Were clients calling you today, or colleagues, and tell us if so, what was top of their mind?
I think it's really the continued uncertainty. Some clients have gotten used to this, and they understand that until you actually see the executive order or the law that puts this measure into place, there's really no telling what's going to happen. And so, at least with respect to the exemption under the CUSMA, there are things that companies can do now to ensure their products qualify for that. So there is something tangible they can engage in and make sure they're doing something for purposes of their supply chain, and making sure they get access to the duty-free market on a duty-free basis to the US market. But overall, it's just continued concern. I wouldn't say panic, because we've been through this before. We know that there is a pattern now, especially in this second Trump administration, where very aggressive action is threatened. It is perhaps permitted to come into force for a day or two or some short period, and then Trump pulls back. And so I'm not predicting with 100% certainty that's going to happen here, but there is a good chance that this is merely part of the negotiation, the bluster, and that eventually we will see some kind of arrangement in which Canadian companies can continue to access the US market.
But of course, there is a real cost here, isn't there? I mean, bureaucracy, companies, presumably some are deferring investment plans because of this.
Yes, I think they're all waiting for this ultimately to be resolved. And you know, I look back at when we were looking at these issues back in February and March, everyone thought it would be resolved within a month or two. Here we are now in July. It isn't resolved yet. There is a new deadline of August 1st, hopefully to resolve this with some kind of trade agreement or arrangement pending the renegotiation of the CUSMA. but that uncertainty does have a cost, and I wouldn't be surprised to hear that there are companies that are holding back on investments until they can be assured that if they're going to set something up in Canada, that those products get access to the U.S. market.
We've seen some criticism of Prime Minister Carney, and it's always easy to be on the sidelines throwing bottles, but that he's been weak. I mean, he backed down on the digital services tax. What do you think of the Prime Minister's strategy? I mean, it's a tough job he has right now.
It's very tough, and we're not seeing 90% of really what's going on in those trade negotiations behind the scenes. We don't have eyes on that, and I think you're right. It's very easy to step back as an observer and say, well, how could he give up the DST just a week or two ago, and now we're back into this threats of these huge tariffs. I think really we cannot judge that performance until we see what the deal is. And at this point, it looks like it won't be until August 1st that we see that deal. But I imagine the trade negotiators in Canada, they have their heads down. They're pushing ahead with negotiations. They're used to seeing this bluster. They're used to seeing these proclamations of Trump in the media. And I expect a lot of them are very experienced in what they do, and they're not going to let this distract them, and they're going to continue to push ahead to get a deal that works both for us here in Canada and for the United States.
You know, I remember an oil guy telling me once he had done business with the Russians, and I said, what was that like? And he said, first 20 minutes of every meeting, you had to let them shout at you, and then you could get down to business.